Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to week 8. Now, in week 8, we're basically going to jump into the first of our lectures on the kind of the psychology of culpability and assessing psychological intent from kind of crime scene behaviors with a view of kind of how would this psychology be applied in the court of law as if we were kind of a de facto jury, if you will, kind of on a trial. And the case that we're going to be looking at this week is the case of Elliot Turner. Now, what did Elliot Turner do? So Elliot Turner is, I say this as if I'm proud. I'm not particularly proud. It's just an interesting factoid. Elliot Turner was my brother's best friend growing up. He was a particularly narcissistic boy. He was unbelievably spoiled from a very, very rich family. He thought of himself as kind of too good for everybody else, and I think had certain personality traits associated with that. And eventually he dates this girl, Emily, and she's very pretty, and they seem to be getting on very, very well. And then basically Emily kind of becomes concerned about his controlling, possessive, and violent behaviors, and he ends up murdering her. After after she tries to break up with him after a night of drinking and probably cocaine, and the question that we'll be looking at as a group on Thursday is, to what degree was Elliot's behaviour expressive, or what degree was it instrumental? So what do we mean by that? I mean, well, to what degree did Elliot plan to murder Emily? Was it preconceived, premeditated, if you will? And what degree was it an expressive outrage and an inability to control his own emotions based on the emotions in the situation, and the drugs or alcohol in his system, and the effect that has on kind of his impulse control as a psychological concept, right? Now, I won't answer that question for you. One, because I'm debating it and I don't want to bias you, and two, that's your decision to make based on the evidence presented on Thursday. But the reason that question's important is because we need to know the psychology underpinning the actions that people have done, as in what were the factors going on that were affecting or influencing their decisions, in order to, one, make sure that we punish or incarcerate them correctly, but two, make sure that we rehabilitate or treat them effectively, and three, make sure that we release and manage them effectively. Now, in that sense, there is a very, very big difference between the behavior of somebody who, in a fit of emotional rage, committed a violent act, and someone who has been planning and premeditating to murder somebody, for a pronounced or long period of time, right? It's a very classic kind of a classification, if you will, in the kind of the homicide literature between these two things. But the Elliot Turner case, and the reason I choose it is because he's very interesting, because he actually says before the murder about how he's going to murder Emily and all of these different things. He literally says it out loud, and then he actually does it. It's a fascinating case of kind of, is it just a big mouth who accidentally once said something that he actually followed up on, or is it that he was a premeditated and controlling and narcissistic evil individual who can't handle the concept of rejection and therefore thinks that he's so gifted and talented and perfect that he can murder instead, But even if you sentence those two people the exact same, how you treat them, and if you try rehabilitate them, and if you do release them, is completely different, because the underlying psychological etiology and I guess vulnerabilities that led to their action are two completely different parts. One is kind of an impulse control, emotional management issue, and the other is very much a cognitive, rational, calculated decision-making process. And so you'd need to know that in order to have any chance of releasing them and managing them, or or at the very least attempting to rehabilitate them. And also, interestingly, in that is there's very different perceptions on the degree to which you could assume one of those could or could not be rehabilitated. So there's so many nuances to the question of, well, what was it from a psychological standpoint that was driving their criminal behavior, and how much can we assess that from an individual? So that's kind of what I chose this paper, just because the methods are relatively prototypical, and it's not a bad one, to be honest. There aren't many bad ones, but there we go. So in this paper, what they basically do, and I really just want to get to the behavior aspect rather than the introduction, to be honest, is they basically look at this idea of expressiveness and instrumentality, and does it manifest itself in homicide cases? So they use a database of 448 homicide cases, basically collected in Spain, right? So I'm not going to go too much into the literature review, but what they're basically saying is that there is psychologists have drawn a double dissociation, and this actually comes down to the first couple weeks lectures, where we talked about instrumentality versus we kind of talked about the FBI kind of practitioner experience investigative model of profiling, and we talked about they use experience and heuristics in order to assess kind of the likely characteristics of the criminal. Now that, from a profiling question, is an expressive murder has different implications for who the potential criminal would be, as does an instrumental murder. Moving to the jury and the court side of things, there's very different implications for how you conceptualize and treat the case based on who the murderer is. So it's an extension of the same idea, but the lit review here is basically saying the same thing, that there's instrumental violence, which is driven by a desire for monetary or some kind of motivational gain, and then there's expressive violence, which basically is a emotional reaction. If you imagine the Ferguson model in this week's lecture, an emotional reaction and an inability to control one's impulses when put in a stressful situation. Right, so they basically say that that's been found in a bunch of other places, and that it's been tested a couple of times, and they basically want to see if the same is true. If the same is true in Spain. So what they do, and I think it's very interesting, what they do basically is they collect this data of 600 or so Spanish cases, which they refine down to 448, and they collect and code all of these kind of crime scene behaviors, and offender-based behaviours, because again, this is kind of a profile-y paper, but these crime scene behaviours and offender behaviours based within each of these individual cases. So the way that these are done is they're coded in a binary fashion. Was it indoor? Yes, no. Was it outdoor? Yes, no. Did they murder in a vehicle? What was their method of approach? And that what they've done is they've done binary for each of them, right? And so basically they're coding all of these yes, no, yes, no, yes, no questions. And then what they do, and I think this is really interesting, and one of the reasons, again, I chose this paper, is that as a forensic psychologist, it bodes well to learn about multidimensional scaling as a kind of an analytical concept, and that's something that they do in this paper, right? They do a multidimensional scaling model in order to assist with our analysis here. So what a multidimensional scaling model is it is a statistical method of detecting the co-occurrence of variables within a data set. So right, one of the ways I would teach multidimensional scaling to students is I would say, right, I want you to think about clothing, right? And all of the possible items of clothing that you could wear. So, we'd have t-shirt, tie, shirt, blouse, socks, sandals, shorts, jeans, leggings, jeggings. If people still wear jeggings, I'm not sure if they're a thing still. I don't know why they were ever a thing, but there we go. Right, all these different clothes, right? And then for every single individual who walks into my lecture or who I see in the world, right, I'm going to mark what clothes they were wearing. So was individual A was wearing a baseball cap, shorts, and a t-shirt. Okay, cool. Individual B was wearing tie, shirt, suit, smart shoes. Cool. Okay. Individual C was wearing a, jeans and a hoodie. Okay, cool. Right. And I'll do that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. When I put all of that data into my multidimensional scaling model, what my multidimensional scaling model is going to tell me is it's basically going to tell me, or it's going to show me almost visually, if you will, what items of clothing are likely to be worn at the same time by the same person. So with the clothing example, what is likely to co-occur? Shirt and tie, right? If you're wearing a shirt, you're likely to be wearing a tie. You're not likely to be wearing a tie and a t-shirt, right? Socks and sandals. Ideally, they will be on completely opposite sides of the scale, right? So it's this visual method of mapping clusters and co-occurrences of behaviors. And basically, it was David Cantor again who originally kind of said, well, this is a really interesting way of grouping different crime scene behaviors. And if we group different crime scene behaviors, maybe what we can do is we can identify these underlying kind of psychological motivations or stories, if you will, that lead to this kind of common co-occurrence. And then if you reverse engineer that, you get your profiling idea. So that's kind of what they do in kind of figure one here, is they basically kind of put all of these crime scene behaviors in, and they kick out basically the co-occurrence of all of these behaviors in this sample of 448 Spanish homicides. And so if you kind of look here, so you've got, I'm trying to think, so an interesting one down here is at the very bottom you've got arson and stole, right? So when people do elements of arson, so I guess they burn things at the same time, they're also likely to steal from the individual. It's quite interesting. Whereas if you look kind of up in the kind of the middle area here, you kind of have, I'm sorry, my eyes aren't very good. Vehicle and staged is another one. So you got on the left side here, if they committed it in a vehicle, they likely then staged the body afterwards. So again, what it's showing you is those two behaviors co-occur relatively similarly to each other, though they are rare. And what's interesting is that those behaviors occur very rarely with the behaviors down in the bottom right corner, which is stealing or arson. So they don't steal and stage the body. They don't kill them in a vehicle and then burn it. Those behaviors don't occur very often together. So when you're looking at a multidimensional scaling model, that's what you're kind of seeing. The closer two variables are visually, the more likely they are to co-occur. And then what you do as a psychologist, and this is now on kind of page 8, is you then analyze that and identify basically themes of behavior that are that group together or underlie these behaviors. So if I was looking at my clothing MDS or SSA, you can use both, multidimensional scaling or smaller space analysis. If I was looking at my clothing multidimensional scaling model, right, and I saw on one side, top left corner, I saw, shorts, t-shirts, sandals. And on the bottom right corner, I saw fur coat, knitted sweater, jeans and Ugg boots or Sperry boots or whatever it was, right? On the top left, I would be like, okay, well, that's a theme there. What's the theme? Well, the theme is it's fucking hot outside, right? It's the summer, right? So that's there's something, a theoretical concept that groups all of those together and explains why they're happening at the same time. In the bottom right corner, well, what explains, all of the co-occurrence of those behaviors? Well, it's winter, right? So the theme of winter explains why those behaviors are together. So they basically do the same thing here. So they kind of group their behaviors. So they have kind of expressive distancing, expressive family, expressive impulsive, instrumental opportunist, and instrumental gratification. So they're collecting or identifying, if you will, different themes of behavior that or different psychological concepts, if you will, that group and explain why all of these homicidal behaviors are occurring kind of with each other. And I think if we just look at the expressive impulsive as kind of one of the clearly the biggest one there, right? And what they basically say is that's kind of basic violence. It's the most predominant characteristics. It happens in interior locations using opportunistic, sharp weapons. They tend to be located by the police during investigations because they haven't really thought about getting rid of it. The aggressors tend to be male, aged between 31 and 50, with a past criminal record. Please see the lecture on violent personalities. And the victims tend to be male, right? So what is it? It's men opportunistically beating the shit and murdering other men with weapons that they grab in their near vicinity, right? These homicides are characterized by a lack of planning and premeditation, and violent and impulsive and emotional in their nature, right? Victim's body tends to be found at the site, revealing a lack of intent to hide or destroy the evidence. Absolutely prototypical expressive impulsive violence. But we could contrast that, if you will, and personally, I'm not entirely sure about developing a typology of 3 behaviours. I generally think 5 typologies from a smaller space analysis is aggressive anyway. But if you look at the instrumental example, so, instrumental gratification, the 5th and final typology is characterised by its instrumental nature. The victims are perceived as by a means of achieving the aggressor's main goal, which is to obtain sexual or economic gratification. Right? That's why stealing's there. That's why sexual behaviour's there. Likely it is possible there will be no evidence, since the perpetrator may have removed all incriminating evidence by starting a fire at the crime scene. It's a completely different type of violence to the expressive impulsive, done by a completely different individual for completely different reasons, right? And so that is what these typology approaches are all about. They are all about identifying the differences in the psychological nature of the crimes that are being committed, in order to allow you to understand the nature of the perpetrator, which in a profiling sense is reverse engineered to help you identify who the perpetrator may be. In a legal sense is whatever the opposite of reverse engineered is, I suppose, just continually engineered to allow you to learn something about why the individual was committing that crime. And what is that? Why do you do that? Because if you're thinking about a concept such as culpability, the degree to which they are culpable will likely vary between the different typologies of violence, right? So someone who is an instrumental gratification offender who steals, sexually exploits, and then burns the evidence likely is a significant more degree culpable than somebody who, in a drunken or emotional rage, murders somebody else with a weapon that they had to hand at that time. Right? It's that shades of grey. It's the nuance within the case. Both are murderers, absolutely. Both are guilty, absolutely. But there are psychological shades of grey between their degree of culpability, and you can only know that by analysing and understanding the psychological antecedents or typology, if you will, of the crime in which you're looking at. So going forward to the discussion again, and I don't think this paper rocks anybody's world, but I like it because it includes the methods that I like. It kind of shows that it's universal with a cross-cultural audience. It was open source, which meant it was free to everybody, always a great one. But, it basically just shows you that in this sample of 458 murders, there are a range of different, a range of disaggregating motivations that are critical to how you think about the psychology of the individual who committed that crime and the implications henceforth of that. And again, it was found, this idea of, of instrumental expressive was founded in the FBI in the 1980s, continued on through Cantor in the 1990s, and here we are in 2019. Again, another reason I chose it, to show that it's still kind of being used now, still being used in 2019 as a way of exploring the relationship between the relationship and or the psychology driving the offender in these homicides. And what this shows you, along with any of the other papers they cite, Gerard's work, Salfati's work, Cantor's work, that, there is a big psychological difference, both psychologically and behaviorally, between someone who plans to murder someone and has a degree of premeditation and someone who is overcome with emotion in the moment. And what we have to then do going forward as psychologists is identify which one it is, first and foremost, and then think about the implications of that for questions such as, how much are they sentenced for? How do we treat them? How do we rehabilitate them? And do we ever release them? Critical questions that the legal system has to ask, we can only tap into by unpicking and understanding the relationship or the psychological motivation, if you will, of the offender at the time of the crime. And so just the multidimensional scaling model is a really nice way of showing you that a way that we can approach that is kind of trying to split these crime types into kind of superordinate themes that are leveraging psychological concepts. One is premeditation, rational choice, etc., and one is impulse control, expressive, emotional overloads, and all this kind of stuff. So I really hope you enjoyed this paper. Definitely give it a read or check out some of the early Cantor work on this. Google Scholar, type in instrumental expressive, and you'll have more than your fair share to read. But I hope you enjoyed it, and it's just this concept of disaggregation and culpability is one that we're going to be taking forward for the next few weeks, and I hope this was a lovely introduction to that. So thank you very much for listening or watching, whichever you chose to do, and I very much look forward to speaking to you more about this on Thursday. So have a great day.